The moment my husband looked my mother in the eye and said she had the manners of a woman who'd never left a small town and smiled doing it, I felt something go very quiet inside me. Not the kind of quiet that means you're holding back tears. The kind that means something has already been decided. That dinner was 3 weeks ago. Today, I watched him sit across from two lawyers he had never met, his hands flat on his desk, his face the color of old paper, as my brother read aloud from a document that described, in precise legal language, exactly who I am and exactly what I own. My husband had no idea. He had spent 4 years making sure I knew my place. It turned out he had never known mine. But I should start at the beginning. My name is Claire, I'm 38 years old. I grew up in Oakville, Ontario, in the same house my grandparents built after my grandfather emigrated from Glasgow with $40 and a trade certification. My mother taught elementary school for 31 years. My father ran a small property management company, or so I always understood. He drove a Ford F-150. He packed his own lunch. He coached my hockey team on Saturday mornings, and never once talked about money at the dinner table. I met my husband Daniel at a conference in Toronto when I was 33. He was charming in that specific way that some men in finance are charming, attentive, polished, always knowing which wine to order. He told me on our third date that he admired how grounded I seemed. "You're not like the women I usually meet," he said, and I took that as a compliment. I shouldn't have. We married 14 months later. He proposed at Canoe Restaurant overlooking the city, and my mother cried, and my father shook Daniel's hand for a long time without saying much. I thought my father was just being quiet in the way he always was. I understand now that he was watching. The first year was fine. The second year, things began to shift in ways that were hard to name. Daniel started making small comments about the way I dressed for his firm's events, about the neighborhood I'd grown up in, about the fact that my parents drove practical cars. He said these things lightly, as jokes, and when I bristled he would look wounded and say I was too sensitive. I began second-guessing my own reactions. That is, I think, precisely what he intended. By our third year, I had become someone I didn't entirely recognize. I dressed the way he preferred. I stopped mentioning my childhood friends. I let him speak over me at dinner parties and told myself it was just his personality, that he was enthusiastic, that I was being unfair. The dinner 3 weeks ago was my parents' 40th anniversary. My brother James had flown in from Vancouver. My aunt and uncle drove up from Hamilton. Daniel knew what the evening meant. I had told him, clearly, that I needed him to be kind. He was not kind. It started with the wine. My father had opened a bottle he'd been keeping, nothing expensive, a Niagara Peninsula red he'd bought at the winery on a trip years ago. Daniel looked at the label and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "This is sweet," he said, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. My father said nothing. My mother smiled and poured herself a glass. Then Daniel started talking about real estate. He does this, fills silence with the sound of his own expertise. He talked about property values in Oakville. About how the area had really come up. About how people who'd bought early had been lucky, even if they didn't know what they were doing. My uncle, who has lived in Hamilton his whole life and has never pretended otherwise, nodded politely. My mother looked at her plate. Then my husband said it. He was talking about background, about how he thought people were too precious about where they came from, and he turned to my mother and said, "No offense, but Claire always had that small-town sweetness about her. You did well raising her." Considering. The table went quiet. My brother looked at Daniel with an expression I recognized. James has always had my father's eyes, patient and absolutely cold when they need to be. My aunt touched my mother's hand. My father put down his fork very carefully. I looked at my husband. He was smiling. He genuinely did not understand what he had just done. I excused myself. I walked to the bathroom at the end of the hall, the one with the tiles my father had laid himself the summer I was 12, and I sat on the edge of the tub and breathed slowly. I was not going to cry. I was done crying over this man. What I felt instead was a kind of crystalline clarity. I thought about the 4 years. I thought about all the times I had made myself smaller. I thought about my mother's face at that table, not hurt, not even angry, just tired in a way that no woman who spent 31 years loving other people's children should ever look at a family dinner. I thought. This ends. I didn't confront Daniel that night. I drove back with him in silence, and when he asked if I was sulking, I said I was tired. He accepted that easily. Men like Daniel always do, they prefer the simple explanation. That night, I called my brother. James listened without interrupting, which is something he learned from our father. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Claire, I think it's time Dad told you some things." I asked what he meant. James said, "Just call him. Tomorrow. Early." I called my father the next morning at 7:15. He picked up on the second ring. I need to try to explain my father properly, because understanding this story depends on understanding him. He is a man of almost no performance. He does not talk about himself. He does not own things to display them. When I was growing up, the only signs of any unusual financial capacity were small and easy to rationalize. A family trip to Scotland every few years, the fact that my university tuition was simply never a subject of discussion, the way certain phone calls would happen behind a closed office door. I assumed he was careful with money. Many people from his background are. On the phone that morning, he asked me how I was. I told him what had happened at the dinner, though I suspected James had already given him the outline. My father listened. Then he said, "Come over this afternoon. Bring nothing. Just come." I drove to my parents' house at 2 o'clock. My father was in the kitchen. He poured us both coffee and sat down and said, without any preamble, "There are things about your grandfather's company that I should have told you a long time ago." What followed was 2 hours that rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own life. My grandfather's trade certification had been in civil engineering. The $40 he'd arrived with had been the only honest part of the story. Everything else he built himself. Over 50 years. Starting with a small contracting firm in Mississauga that grew into a property development company, then a construction group, then a holding company with assets that, by the time my grandfather died, spanned commercial real estate across Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. Along with minority stakes in 3 infrastructure projects and a private equity fund my father had quietly continued building for the past 20 years. The Ford F-150. The packed lunches. The Saturday morning hockey practices. None of it was false. My father is genuinely that man. But he is also, it turns out, worth considerably more than I had ever imagined, and more to the point, so am I. My grandfather had structured his estate carefully. My father, my uncle, and my aunt each held shares in the holding company. But my grandfather had also set aside a separate trust divided equally between his grandchildren that became accessible at 35. I had turned 35 2 years ago. The paperwork had been filed. The trust was mine. It had been mine for 24 months. I sat across from my father and tried to absorb this. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at his coffee and said, "Because I wanted you to know who you were before you knew what you had. Your grandmother insisted on the same thing with me." He paused. "I should have told you when you turned 35. I was going to. And then you married Daniel and I could see what he was, and I thought I'll wait. I'll wait until you can see it too." I asked him how long he'd been watching. He said, "Since before the wedding." I shook his hand and I knew. I asked why he hadn't said anything. He looked at me directly and said, "Because it wasn't my life, Claire. It's yours. I was not going to take that from you." I sat with my father for a long time that afternoon. When I left, I called a lawyer, not one my father suggested, but one I found myself, a family law specialist in downtown Toronto with a formidable reputation. Her name was Margaret, and when I sat in her office 2 days later and explained my situation, she looked at the trust documents my father had couriered over and was quiet for a moment and then said, "All right. Let's talk about what you want." What I wanted was clear and simple. I wanted it over. I wanted to leave my marriage. I wanted the process to be clean. And I wanted my husband to understand, fully and without ambiguity, exactly whom he had been dismissing for 4 years. Margaret was thorough. Over the following 2 weeks, she and her team reviewed the structure of the trust, confirmed the asset valuations, and prepared a comprehensive separation agreement. Because Daniel and I had signed a prenuptial agreement, Daniel had insisted. Citing the standard reasoning of someone who considers themselves the financially significant partner, the legal situation was relatively straightforward. Margaret's role was to make sure the documentation was complete, the separation was clean, and that Daniel received the full picture at a moment and in a manner of my choosing. My brother James flew back from Vancouver. He did not need to, I did not ask him to, but he said he wanted to be there. The meeting was scheduled at Daniel's office. I had asked for that specifically. I wanted him in his own space, at his own desk, in the building where he had spent 4 years telling colleagues and clients about his life. I wanted him to receive this information in a context where he had always felt in control. Daniel thought we were meeting to discuss the terms of a separation he had already assumed would go his way. He had texted me the evening before, something about ensuring we both approached this like adults. I had replied that I looked forward to the conversation. When James and I arrived, Daniel's assistant showed us in. Daniel was behind his desk in a charcoal suit. He looked at my brother with mild irritation he had not expected anyone else and said. James said, "I'm here as a witness and because Claire asked me to be." And then he sat down and said nothing further. Margaret's associate, a composed young woman named Sophie, arrived 90 seconds later with a document case. She sat beside me. Daniel looked at the case and then at me, and I watched his certainty begin, very slightly, to loosen. Sophie opened the case and placed a document in front of Daniel. She identified it as a copy of the separation agreement, and explained that it would also contain, as an appendix, a formal disclosure of assets as required under the Ontario Family Law Act. Daniel looked at the first page. He turned to the second. I watched his eyes move and then stop. He looked up at me. His voice came out differently than usual, a half step higher. "Careful. What is this?" Sophie told him it was a complete disclosure of the trust assets registered in my name, along with an overview of my interest in the family holding company. Daniel looked back at the page. He turned to the appendix. I had seen the documents before, but watching him read them was a different experience. I watched the number land. I watched him reread it. I watched the version of me he had constructed, the small-town girl, the wife he had generously elevated, dissolve quietly in the middle of his own office. "This isn't," he stopped. He started again. "Your father's company," I said. "My grandfather's company. And the trust is mine independently. It's been mine since I turned 35. He sat back. His hands were on the desk in front of him, and I could see them, very still, very flat, the way hands go when a person is working hard not to show what they're feeling. James said nothing. Sophie said nothing. I said nothing. Daniel said, and his voice was quieter now, something underneath it that might have been the beginning of shame. "You knew. When we got married." "I didn't know," I said. "That's the truth. I didn't know the scope of it. But it doesn't matter, Daniel. That's not the point." He looked at me. "Then what is the point?" I had thought about how to answer this question. I had rehearsed several versions. In the end, I said the simple one. "The point is that you looked at my mother and said considering. You said that to her at her own anniversary dinner, in front of her family. And you've been saying versions of it to me for 4 years. And you believed it. You genuinely believed I was less than you, and that I should be grateful, and that the story of my life was one you had the authority to summarize." He said nothing. "The money isn't the point," I continued. "But I am glad that you're reading those numbers right now, because I want you to understand that what you were dismissing was not my family's limitations. It was your own blindness. My father drove a Ford and packed his lunch because that is who he is, not because he had no other options." Daniel opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked at the papers. He looked at me. He looked, briefly, at James, who returned the look with the same patient quiet our father would have used. Then Daniel said something I had not expected. He didn't get angry. He didn't threaten. He said, very quietly, "I'm sorry about what I said to your mother." It landed differently than I had imagined it would. Not because I believed him, I think he was sorry. But I think he was sorry in the way that people are sorry when they understand the consequences rather than when they understand the wrong. But it landed, and I let it sit there. I said, "That's between you and her. I'd suggest you call her." Sophie indicated the relevant pages of the agreement. We went through the terms. Daniel had his own counsel review it within the week. His lawyer, I was told, found it straightforward and recommended he sign. The divorce was finalized earlier than I expected, as these things sometimes are when the legal position of one party is not what the other had assumed. I moved back to Oakville for 2 months. I stayed in my childhood room with the old quilt my grandmother had made and the hockey trophies on the shelf that my father had never taken down. And in the mornings I sat with my parents at the kitchen table and drank coffee while my father read the paper and my mother talked about her garden. I am not going to say that I emerged from those months as a fully formed new person. What I did was slowly relearn the sound of my own voice, the cadence of my own opinions, the particular way I like my coffee and the specific things I find funny. And the fact that I am deeply, constitutionally not interested in other people's approval. These are not new things. They are things I always knew and was persuaded, over 4 years, to distrust. I'm back in Toronto now, in an apartment I chose, with furniture I picked, with a calendar that belongs to me. I've been consulting part-time on a property development project, something that grew from a conversation with my father's CFO who mentioned they were looking for someone with my background in environmental planning. I don't know yet if it will grow into something larger. I am not in a hurry. My mother, I should tell you, received a phone call from Daniel approximately 3 weeks after that meeting. I don't know exactly what was said. My mother is private about some things, but she told me afterward that he had apologized, and that she had listened, and that she had told him she hoped he would think carefully about how he spoke to people going forward. My mother spent 31 years teaching children. She knows how to close a conversation with dignity. My father never said "I told you so." He's not that kind of man. What he did was take me to the Niagara winery the weekend after I moved home. And we walked through the vines in the October cold and he bought 6 bottles of the same red Daniel had turned his nose up at, and we drove home and opened one with dinner. And my father poured himself a glass and said, "Your grandfather would have liked you." That's the whole of it, I suppose. Not the numbers in the documents, not the moment Daniel's certainty collapsed, though I won't pretend I didn't feel something when I watched that happen. The whole of it is a Tuesday afternoon drive through wine country with my father, and a glass of something unpretentious and good, and the knowledge that the story of where I came from is far longer, far sturdier, and far more mine than anyone else ever had the right to define. I am still learning what it means to take up the space I'm entitled to. I think that will take longer than the divorce did. But I'm not in a hurry for that either. Some things are worth doing at the right pace.